I'm back to my same old ways. I swear I try to change. You just feel so right when I do wrong. So right along.
Welcome everybody to episode 8, Harder Than Healing. This episode's called FUBAR, and it is the Triggers episode. And so, great little conversation to kick us off. And so now, obviously, things are a little different, because if you're watching this, you will see that our producer, Tiffany Morgan, is in the hot seat.
One MC on the hot seat.
One MC. God, Mike. Tiff, how you doing?
I'm doing okay.
Right on, man.
I'm having a really good time with you guys.
Nice.
Mutual. So we basically have one question to explore for the first half hour, and then we got a real special guest coming through for the second half. Do you want to tee up a little bit for us, Malloy, who's coming in the second half?
I'll tee it up a little bit. So, gentleman that I met, gosh, it's been probably a year ago now, Kyle Quincy, played, I believe, 14 years in the NHL. And we started having a discussion about similarities between professional athlete and military. And we found out there's a ton, right? There's a boatload of similarities. So he's going to come on and talk about whatever he wants to talk about, and I'm going to explore the similarities with him.
Right on. And then for us being here, we're now almost through the first season. Mm-hmm. We've been through some really cool and heavy shit together.
Intense.
Mm-hmm. Very.
And so we felt like this would be a really good episode to explore something that has definitely happened to all of us over the course of the season, and something that is very top of mind for a lot of folks grappling with mental health, and that is triggers. So I wonder if the clinicians could just briefly explain what we mean when we talk about triggers, and then we can talk about what the four of us have experienced this season.
You want to start?
It's always you.
So the way I like to explain triggers is pretty straightforward. You have 5 senses, and in some way, shape, or form, those 5 senses interpret your world and send those signals to the brain. And in a time of crisis, those things that reach the brain are going to potentially become triggers. So for me, Iraq was a very IED-rich tool for the insurgents, and so it was usually made with something that we call HME, or homemade explosives, and it smells like fuel when you're around these things. And so going to a gas station when I first got back from Iraq was weird, and I didn't really know why. And so my trigger was fuel, and I had to take a while to recognize that. Right? It was like, wait, I'm at this gas station. Why do I feel weird? And I feel this sensation, even the hair standing up on the back of my neck. And I'm like, that's just weird. Why is that occurring now? Took a little bit of introspection to figure that out.
I think the part that you just said is it takes a while to figure it out, because it becomes something that's so ingrained.
Yeah.
That it's not like somebody's poking you and you're like, that's triggering. I mean, although if you're ever interacted with a teenager, you might, you're triggering me.
Don't touch me.
Right.
Poking the bear.
Right. Exactly.
But I think when I think about triggers and how I like to explain them to my veterans is that you can go your entire life and not really know all your triggers or exactly why you feel the way that you do. The brain gets it because, like I said, the 5 senses access the brain, and when they do, if there's a moment of crisis, your brain is designed to make sure it remembers that, whether or not you consciously do.
So, question for you is: Are triggers then is the connotation there, or the assumption that a trigger is going to be a negative thing, or can a trigger be anything?
It can be anything.
Okay, so it can be like every time I smell cut grass, I think about soccer preseason.
Sure.
That's a good. It's good. It's intense. It's rich, but that is also a trigger because there's a pathway in my brain.
Absolutely.
Far out.
That's been outlined, and that's a positive one, right? I mean,
Okay.
and I think the cutting grass is a perfect example. It's the smell of walking into grandma's house and it smells like apple pie,
Yeah.
right? Like that's also a trigger.
Yeah.
So it doesn't necessarily always need to be a negative thing. It's just something that's activated without you actively pulling for it. It's
Like-
something that's present.
I feel like the holidays, right? So like when you get to the holiday, especially if you love them, there's reminders everywhere. One of the things that I thought was interesting is some of my, so when I was deployed, some of my soldiers would tell me things like, hey, it's easy to be sober here. And I was like, well, yeah, because, it's like rule number one, you're not supposed to drink, overseas and blah, 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 which is literally UCMJ, Uniform Code of Military Justice.
There we go. Nice.
But the design behind it is also that there's no bars, right? There's no convenience store that is set up with, all these Budweiser signs or, Coors signs or whatever signs. So you end up having this ability to navigate your environment without all of that advertising that.
No solo cups.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. Or I was going to say there's probably a lack of women scantily clad, dressed and everything else too, right? That like provoke this like party atmosphere potentially. But I mean, there's no triggering things that push you to that place.
So all right. So real quick, because we're going to get into some of the, I think probably some of the more gnarly triggers that we experience, but just out of curiosity. So my is, so you were saying holidays or apple pie, right? Mine is like cut grass. What's a smell that just
Sage.
sage?
Sage and rain. Like when it rains on the
rain's a good
sagebrush.
one.
Reminds me of home. In a good way. Because I'm from Wyoming. So it's just everywhere.
Yeah. The smell of rain is beautiful. It's definitely one of those.
I feel like it's like when fall starts to come in, it's just the
the
temperature
crunch- yeah,
in the air for me is like super refreshing. And I don't know why, but I come alive. And I'm a baseball guy, so it would be summertime more than likely for me. But no, it's fall.
Also snow. I don't know that snow has a smell, but anytime it's about to snow, I can smell, it smells different to me. And I enjoy snow, so it's a good trigger.
Cortisol?
I used to enjoy snow.
Different smell.
different smell. Yeah. You want to smell cortisol? Go to Ranger School and experience anytime they go into the field and it's like a stench. And everybody that's been to Ranger School is like, yep, I know exactly what you're talking about.
Shout out cortisol.
See if they can get them to be our next sponsor.
Yeah, for real.
This episode is sponsored by
Cortisol.
So I will say, I just want to lead this off by saying that one of the things that's been really interesting for me is that I have I don't know if it's like Tom Joad syndrome or like what it is, but in large part because of the household I grew up in and then the line of work I've gone into, I really take a tremendous amount of pride in this very humanist, looking out for the little guy. I'm looking out for those who have, whether it's, sort of been on the receiving end of systemic stuff in society or whether it's historically marginalized populations because of identity, whatever it is, man, that is my fight. Those have always been my students. My classrooms have always been safe spaces for them. A lot of the people who were really kind to me and were very welcoming to me growing up when I had a very sort of like untethered sense of self were from those communities. And I was like, all right, their fight is my fight, right? And what's interesting is that I have been coming to realize that I associate a lot of the self-care language. And again, I'm in a room with people who have devoted themselves to healing people, right? That is like intellectually, I know that Malloy is a clinician who does amazing work helping veterans. I know that Nathaniel is a clinician who does amazing work helping people on the learning difference spectrum. Tiffany, I know you're a clinician who does amazing work helping veterans and people who need help. And yet, when I hear self-care vocabulary, my mind processes that, triggers for me, oh, that's selfish. Oh, that's, you know, and again, let's think about like where I lived. I grew up right outside of New York, which is a very like tribal environment, right? And then I lived in LA, which is a very don't tell me what to do environment. And so I've been around a lot of people who both actively don't care about the communities that I've devoted myself to advocating for, who also say, oh yeah, of course I do ice bath plunges. You got to take care of yourself. And so it's very tied up for me, and it's not accurate. Intellectually, I know what you all do. Emotionally, I've grown very close to you guys as co-hosts and as producers. And sometimes there's stuff you say where I'm like, only assholes say that.
I can see that.
And it's
I'll own
just
that.
yeah, well, but it's you know, I just wanted to I don't know, I guess I wanted to get that one off my chest just because I know it's not accurate, and I also know that it comes from a place of actual experience. And that's, I think, the thing that's complicated about triggers is that you also have this like true and not true experience where you know you're right, Malloy, you're in a gas station in Thornton, right? There's no IEDs there, but your brain is like, there's IEDs here.
Yep. And there's this piece of me too that remembers I got back from Iraq and I had a buddy of mine at the time who bought me a new car. I sent him the money and I was like, hey, can you buy me a new car? Because I left and I sold my car. So 15 months later, I need a new car.
Word.
And he comes to show up. And by the way, like when you're deployed for that long and you don't have bills and you didn't have any, you know, financial issues, I saved a boatload of money. So I bought myself at the time like a $50,000 BMW M5.
Which was just fun.
It was
It was
gorgeous.
just fun.
And oh, by the way, I couldn't drive it from the first place that I saw it, and my buddy had to drive it.
Okay.
And I remember getting into the car, and then I turned it on, and I remember sitting there thinking like, wow, this is beautiful. And then I was like, okay, I'm not putting this sucker in drive. I can't do it, period, the end. I got out, and I was like, hey, you mind driving us wherever else? He's like, you don't want to drive it? And I was like, nope. And he was like, oh my God, really? And I remember thinking to myself, like, I am comfortable enough in my own skin to say, like, this is a bad idea for me to drive this car right now.
Wow.
Yep.
And it was probably a week or so before I got to it. But once I started driving, I started to recognize, oh, okay, so that's why, because you started thinking about, I mean, when we're in Iraq, I told guys, like, I'm the commander, right? So I'm giving my patrol brief and I'm like, hey guys, you guys see something on the side of the road, call it out, right? Like my 2 truck, which very, very talented person at seeing something and being like, nah, it's nothing. It's nothing. And then he sees something. I'm like, dude, it looks like a pile of trash. And he was like, call EOD. We need them come out. And the next thing you know, that thing's blowing up. And I was like,
Explosive
wow, like,
ordnance
yeah,
detonation?
EOD. So that's
Explosive ordnance disposal.
Thank you.
Disposal. That's
and
close.
so I remember thinking like, wow. So as soon as you see something like that, you can't go anywhere without calling EOD, right? That's just TTP, so tactics, techniques, and procedures. So we do that and we call them out and they come blow this thing up. I was like, wow, you're talented. Like, that is really cool. And when I got back, I was like, oh,
You don't have your 2 truck.
I don't have my 2 truck. I don't have nothing in front of me. It is me making the call on this one. And I'm like you said, there's no IEDs in Thornton. Really? What am I doing?
Right.
You know, I'm driving down I-25 and I'm like, ooh, careful. Wait, careful for what? Like, what am I doing here?
Yeah.
So it was a mix. It was a mix of funk until you tell yourself like, okay, you're good. But how long do you need to tell yourself that before that trigger finally subsides?
Yeah, experientially, it's that piece of like, you have to be exposed to it enough so that it's no longer that same activating piece, right? So those orange bags on the side of the road don't mean anything
Right.
anymore. Yeah.
100%. Like I'm curious because I was an Army guy. What would be the pieces for you that would be Navy submarines or boats or ships and that kind of stuff that would be triggering for you? I'm sure it's different than mine.
I don't know that it would be. I mean, there's certainly like smells, all kinds of smells, people smells, non-people smells,
Right.
alarms. So like when that alarm went off in that situation,
wow.
that
Yeah.
was, I mean, alarms going off are supposed to get your attention and get you activated.
Is this situation something you can talk about?
Well, it's not that I can't talk about it. It's just I was not in a good state of mind, and an alarm accidentally went off in the middle of the night, and then I was already not able to sleep, and so then I was just like on high alert until the alarm was able to. And then once the alarm was off, there was definitely no going to sleep after that. So the constant preparing, even though we never had, when I served from 97 to July of 01, so this was pre 9/11. So there wasn't a lot going on. I mean, there's always stuff going on, right? But there wasn't anything major going on that alarms were going off because danger was coming, but alarms were going off for practice for when danger was coming. So it definitely raises my, anywhere I am, if I hear an alarm going off, it's that immediate like, oh, and then I'm like, wait, I'm here. I don't need to go to general
But
quarters
there's the
because I'm
assumption-
not on a ship right now.
If an alarm is going off, it's for Tiffany.
Well, I think the other thing about it is it's the training piece, right? I mean, that's partly what you're talking about. Is that it becomes a part of your
100%.
DNA, as it were.
Never goes away.
Right. Especially, because that's what you're doing. Like, you're training yourself to be hyper alert about, IEDs or about incoming whatever. So the reality of it is, like, you're doing it on purpose, and then the residual effect of that is when you go to the gas station or when you see a garbage bag or when you hear an alarm, that still pops up. It doesn't go away because it's become ingrained. The same as grandma's apple pie.
I have so I'll go into a quick story, and I think it'll resonate with people because so water bottles, right? The plastic water bottles.
Oh, yeah.
So
It's your sister.
yeah. So my sister was in the Las Vegas shooting, the massacre there. I think a lot of people will just be familiar with the Las Vegas massacre, also I'll put it that way. And she was on, whatever not up against the stage, but she was pretty close to it. And she said that the thing that got her the most after this was the crunching of a water bottle. When people finish the water bottle and they just kind of smash it before they throw it in the trash. And I remember, being next to her and doing that and then being like, oh, shoot, are you okay? And she was like, yeah, I'm fine. But then she told me the story, right? And it's like, bullets are whizzing through these plastic things. People are falling on these plastic things. People might even be hiding behind those plastic things, right? And she was saying that, like, the crunch of that now is just like reliving that whole entire thing. And so when you say alarms, I was thinking, you don't know when alarms are going to go off, right? And then they just go off, and how incredibly taxing on the nervous system that's going to be. It just immediately draws those nails to the chalkboard. And I couldn't imagine it being, a water bottle, but I mean, there's all kinds of other things too, right? And it just sends your nervous system into this terrible place.
I mean, it's interesting how you all started your explanation of triggers by talking about the five senses. And I think it's interesting how there's such a diversity of whether it's smells, it can be sounds, it can be words, it can be, it's such a spectrum. And you guys are also talking about how you don't necessarily even consciously know what is happening. You just know something is.
Well, and an interesting thing specifically about military, right, outside of like your sister going through that situation, is when for example, when you hear an alarm in the military, there's steps that you need to take immediately following that. I need to do this, this, and this, and get to this place and talk to this person and check these things out and whatever. So that follows you too. So like you hear the alarm and immediately in your head, what do I need to do now? Versus just panicking you're trying to find some direction. Where do I go with this trigger?
It's that training of the fight, flight, or freeze. Yeah.
So there's this recurring dream that I have, right? And I don't call it a nightmare because I don't feel like there's any scariness to it as much as it's just this recurring thing. And I'm in an airport, and I think I've told you about this. And I'm in an airport, and I'm past security, and that's a very significant piece because I know that nobody is supposed to have a weapon past security. And then all of a sudden, I hear these like pop, pop, and in my brain, every single time this happens, I'm finding the way to get to this person to try and take them out. And I remember so in my dream, I've jumped over like machines and pushed people to the side and like sliding under things, like all kinds of crazy things because they're dreams. So I can create the whole landscape of trying to get to this person.
This is definitely a Brad Pitt movie.
And, and so I'm running at this sound, right, of these shots. And in the back of my mind, I can't help but think like, and this is going to sound terrible, but I don't care. I can't wait to get to this person. Like it's a craving. And I remember getting close to this person and I'll like, whether I'm jumping, sliding, whatever the heck it is that I'm doing at this person, and they shoot and they get me and I wake up. And I'm always pissed when I wake up because I just didn't get to him. And I remember thinking like, so I'm talking to a friend of mine. And he was telling me like, haven't you ever just thought about just not going after this guy? And I was like, well, I mean, I guess that's a solution, but I don't. But
I'll bet you $1,000, right? If I know dreams and I know Brad Pitt movies, and I know both, you're going to get to the guy, and the guy is you.
Oh, that's true.
Well,
it's like 12 Monkeys all of a sudden or something like that.
That would be interesting. That'd be interesting for sure. I would call myself out and tell myself all sorts of terrible things. But for me, so the triggering piece then becomes with this dream that I constantly have is like, I'm constantly waiting when I get to the airport and dare I say it, fuck around and find out. Like I want my shot at this guy. So don't be that dude coming to get you. But so being in the airport for me is a little different.
That's really interesting. So Tiffany, you have, I wonder, is there any chance your show notes dovetail into Malloy's dream?
I mean, I could say this, that it's interesting hearing that because I have not ever been in a live fire situation, but I've had at least 3 dreams where there was an active shooter and I felt responsible to pursue them. And one of those dreams, I made a bad decision and hid in a bathroom with the door shut, and then I felt trapped. And I woke up and I felt bad about myself. I was like, why would you do that? And so then, like for me, I rewrote the end of that. It was like, what would you actually do, right? Mm-hmm. But it is interesting because I've never been in that situation, and I hope to never be in that situation. But I've had dreams about it and actively pursuing the person.
And having that responsibility element
that
it sounds like Malloy has. That's wild.
Well, it kind of speaks to I talk a lot about this in my military culture class, the sheepdog mentality that people who, whether it's military, law enforcement, whatever, we have that training of what to do when an alarm goes off, when an active shooter, we have the training for those things. And even though that's not our responsibility now, we're still kind of in that mindset that we're still here to protect and serve, even though that's not our role anymore.
So, and that's what's important, hopefully for some of our listeners, when you said it's selfish, right? To have some of these self-care things and you're like thinking like, you're not supposed to have those thoughts. So for me, I'm thinking like, yeah, my veterans, they don't want to have those thoughts. They don't want to have the self-care because their training is that they take care of other people and that they don't take care of themselves. So one of the pieces, and any clinician out there is probably gonna get mad when I say this because there's not enough research on it, but moral injury, right, which is very, very common in military. There's a very specific design in there where you you learn to hate yourself, essentially. And if you learn to hate yourself, what's the fix, if you will, is to learn to love yourself. And so one of the key things to a lot of the stuff that I work on is not only recognizing your triggers, recognizing your thoughts, but somewhere in between that, also finding the space to love yourself, right? And a lot of my veterans will tell you, like, I actively tell them, look at yourself in the mirror and tell yourself that you love yourself. And they always say how difficult that is. And this goes back to that part where you said you got to write the end of that story. Like, a lot of these guys are in positions where they don't get to write the end of their story, right? And so they're stuck there with this like guilt and shame. And if you have guilt and shame, do you know how difficult it has to be at that point to say, like, wow, I also need to have self-care boundaries? Like, that's where it's like saying, well, now not only am I don't know the word that you use, but now the self-love feels like, like terrible. It feels, it feels awful. It feels like you should even be more guilty, for wanting to put yourself first. And the design of that is terrible, because that's what we were trained to do, is love and treat and help other people. And we forget that if we're not doing that for ourselves, we're never going to be helping anybody else.
I talk about this a lot, and I'm sure, Donald, most people use this as like a metaphor, but because when I started working in the veteran community, it was that superhero mentality of like, I want to help others. I haven't fully worked on myself. I've started working on myself, but I haven't really dove in and learned the coping skills and the battle drill, and all the things to keep myself healthy. But I was ready to dive head first in to help other people, and in the process made a lot of mistakes, a lot of unhealthy choices, poor boundaries, all of that. But what I talk about with other veterans that are really wanting to go down that road, I want to help other veterans, I want to help my brothers and sisters, is thinking about when you get on a plane and they give you the safety briefing and they tell you, when the oxygen mask falls, put it on yourself before you try to help somebody else. Because if you aren't breathing, how the heck are you going to help somebody else? And it's the same mentality. If we're not doing, it's not to say that you can't be helping while you're getting help, but if you're not focusing on your own help, how much help are you actually going to be to other people?
That's interesting too, because I recently had that scenario where in my workplace, they were like, look, Nathaniel, you need to like do the airplane oxygen mask thing. Like right now you need to take a breath so that you can like refresh yourself and get back on top of your game. And I think it's difficult to hear. And I think the other piece that's really hard sometimes is doing that. Yeah. Right. Is being able to
because it feels selfish.
Right. Absolutely. Because there's like, I have so much responsibility to all of these people that I'm responsible for, that I'm caring for their, well-being and, their progress, et cetera, and feeling like because you have that obligation to them, you need to stick it out, right? You need to rub some dirt on it and keep moving forward. Right. And we do that.
If you're not able to watch this one, my shirt says "rub dirt on it,"
right? And it's that piece of being able to recognize, like, yes, I should be putting my oxygen mask on first, and it's really hard for me to do that while I'm watching everybody else fumble around and try and put it on, and I can just be like, no, here, just do it like this.
All Points North is the official sponsor of the Harder Than Healing podcast. APN offers custom mental health, trauma, and addiction treatment programs at APN Lodge in Colorado. Visit apn.com to learn more. So question then, in terms of short-term and long-term management around triggers, because we know that triggers can send people spiraling, triggers can send people spiraling into anxiety. They can send people spiraling into depression. Triggers can also definitely send people spiraling to pursue substances to numb whatever trauma a trigger is called up. So can you guys recommend both short-term ways to manage a negative trigger and then maybe longer-term ways if we're talking about carving some new paths in the snow?
You want me to take it?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I call it the battle drill.
Oh, yeah, I like this one.
All right, shout out battle drill.
Here we go.
So if you define it in military, it's how you get your element, if you're a commander, your element from point A to point B on the battlefield through a series of behaviors, maneuvers, and these are all things that you're going to need to rehearsal or have rehearsal for and practice so that you can be good at them. So the battle drill in that same definition then just becomes how you not navigate necessarily combat, but your own emotions, right? So I tell my veterans the way I would play it out in my head, right, is, okay, so something just happens to me and let's say I get angry, and I can look at the person, say like, hey, you know, something that you just did there really got to me. But I know that triggers are inside of me. They're not inside of you. So I'm going to go ahead and go in the next room. I'm going to twiddle my thumbs. I'm going to practice my coping skill that, oh, by the way, I practice day to day.
What could be an example of one of those coping skills?
One of my favorite ones.
My thumb twiddling game is weak.
One of my favorite ones is I call it a minute meditation.
Okay.
So my minute meditation, you can literally do anywhere, potentially not underwater, but anywhere else. You start off by literally, if you're like me and you don't like to close your eyes, you can take a soft gaze on something, right? And then you can start with, for me, I feel my fingertips and I rub my toes around in my socks. You do that for 10 seconds, okay? That's the touch, okay? And then you can start to listen for the sounds in the room, okay? Again, part of the 5 senses, so keep that in mind because that's why this is grounding. You start to listen, and then after that, I pretend like I'm putting a stick of gum into my mouth. Okay, if I put that stick of gum, I get to pick the flavor and I also get to pick the scent. And so I chew on that gum for about 20 seconds. And then after that, I bring everything back with just open up my eyes and I'll look for patterns and colors and stuff in the room so that I can really figure out what's going on with my environment. And the whole entire time trying to do box breathing, which is 4 seconds in, 4 seconds hold, 4 seconds out, 4 seconds hold, and do that. And now if I do all of that, not only have I reset my nervous system by breathing, I've focused on the 5 senses. So anything that could potentially be triggering in the room, I now have control over. And I take that 1 minute and normally at that point have lost whatever was upsetting and pissing me off in the first place. And as a design after that, I'm like, okay, cool, I'm good. So then, so that's what I do when I leave the room. But when I'm talking to this person, I'll say, yeah, I'm going to go into the other room and take a second. And then if you're here when I come back and you want to talk about this and you're ready, then I'll come back. And I tell all my people that person can be there or not be there, and you go through the same scenario, right? You can say it out loud or you can say it to yourself. And if I'm saying it to myself, I don't even care if they hear me or don't hear me. Right? Like if my son was there and I start going to that, he'll just probably roll his eyes and walk into the next room because he already knows what's coming. Right. But then I can just go through that and I know, okay, so that's my scenario. That's what I tell myself and that's what I do. It's muscle memory. So when something triggers me, that's what I do. And then after that, I can deal with something after that because I just have to get my nervous system to a place where I can start to function again. So
my big one, I do the fingers back and forth.
Tapping.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'll do that pretty consistently. And for me, I want to do things that are quiet, that help me get grounded again. And that's the beads piece for me too.
Yeah.
So I'm really tactile around that piece of it.
Yep.
Breathing obviously is something that people will always talk about breathing. The box breathing, the definition of it is really, really useful. The other piece about it though, is you have to practice it. You can't just tell someone that they need to breathe to recenter themselves because that looks 9,000 different ways, So if you say to someone who's, anxious to breathe when they get anxious, they may be,
Right.
oh my God. And it can end up amplifying you as opposed to bringing you back to center. So I think it's super important to make sure that you're clear on what those techniques are for you. And I'm totally tactile. Like when I get frustrated, like I'm like Mr. Miyagi, like the old school.
Rubbing the hands together. Yeah.
Like, I'm frustrated. And it's
You
really,
mean Daniel LaRusso's going to fight?
yeah, I love it. We're doing it. Right. So it's the feeling of the warmth on my hands. It's being able to recenter myself within myself as opposed to looking for something external.
But it sounds like for both of you guys, when you start that rhythm, because you've done it so many times, your body's like, oh, we're doing this now. and it can fall into that habit.
So, and that's why I like to tell my veterans it's the battle drill, right? Because there's no battle drill that you're going to ever do efficiently that you don't practice just over and over and over again.
And also practice in a non-live fire environment, right? I feel like the key to getting something to the point where you can then use it when the chips are down is to first practice it when there are no chips down, so 100%. That you can really.
It's a frequently asked question, right? Because somebody will say like, hey, yeah, you all have all these answers to anger and whatever else, but what if I'm already angry? And it's like, well, yeah, but that's because, you know, you don't go to the Super Bowl or the World Series without an extensive amount of practice, right? So you should be practicing all of these things throughout the day. So if somebody tells me like, well, okay, so when am I supposed to do this breathing? You get to design that.
Now.
You get to pick that.
Right now.
You can do it at the top of an hour. You can do it whenever you want. But the bottom line is that if you put that into your everyday and then all of a sudden crisis happens, you can access it right away. Why is that? Because you're already looking forward to it if you do it every day. Like I go to the gym every day. If I don't go to the gym, I feel like something's missing. And I do that for my mental health. So if I'm getting to the end of the day, I'm going to be like, okay, I'm going to go to breathing or something because I know that I need to look forward to something. So it keeps me,
that's cool.
It keeps me at a baseline, right? And that's why we do all of this stuff, because our nervous system, in yoga, we talk about things like the outward looking eye and the inward looking eye. So for me, the inward looking eye is monitoring my breathing, monitoring the temperature in the room, monitoring those things. The outward looking eye is staring at all the things that can potentially cause anxiety, right? Like you can see somebody shady that's walking around you, or you can see a trigger to, drugs or alcohol, or you can see, like a guy that looks being aggressive to a woman. Those are the things that would trigger me. And all of a sudden I'm anxious. Whereas opposed to staring at that for too long, I could say, okay, well, let's dial it back, soft gaze, check in with my breathing, check in with my heart rate, check in with all those kinds of things. The next thing you know, I'm back to baseline.
And you can do that like in the moment. You don't need like a mat or like a essential oil burner. Like that's what I like about these skills.
I could do it right here on this couch while I'm talking to you guys.
That's
right.
Tiffany,
but
what
only
about,
if you do it a lot though.
That's okay. Right. Exactly. Do you have stuff you go to?
Yeah, I've got a few things. Breathing, especially the box breathing. And obviously these are for different situations, because if you're in the middle of a stressful conversation, you're not going to pull out a coloring book. But I love my coloring book and my colored pencils. So like I'll sit out.
That feels like a power move. If you're having a shitty conversation.
Ain't nobody got time for this shit I'm coloring.
Right. Yeah, right. That would be a power move.
That would be great.
But yeah, like I'll go out on my front porch where I have a beautiful view of the mountains. It's in the shade, so it's, nice temperature, and I just color. And I'm able to zone in on that versus all of the other things. Hiking, just being out in nature, like people probably get irritated going on a hike with me because mostly it's like, how do we get from point A to point B? And I'm like, I want to see and touch all the things on the way. I want to pick up the rocks. I want to eat the berries. I want to jump in the creek. Like I want to do all I want to smell the flowers, literally. But yeah, so different things for different times. But yeah, lots of different things. A lot of nature.
You know what the smell of the flowers thing makes me think of? I had this picture of my kiddo Vince when he was really young, and I was like, you should stop and smell the flowers. We were walking around the block, and he literally just like puts his entire face just into this big pile of flowers. And I'm like, yeah, that's the way that it should be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and I think one of the things that we can oftentimes get lost in our adult brains is how difficult things are, and we forget to just stuff our face in the flowers and just be like fully in it. And I think that in some ways it prevents us from getting to that place where we have that relief that we're searching for, because you get like halfway into the flowers and you're like, okay, that's enough. But you didn't really like give yourself the opportunity to fully experience that moment.
Right.
And reset your system.
Well, and I think there's like I like to think of it as like an internal dialogue, right? Like if your internal dialogue sucks, you're not, that's just not going to change without you have been intentional about it. And one of the things that you used to say, when back in our 30s, when we're, roaming around downtown Denver, having a good time. And all of a sudden I turn around and Nathaniel's like 15 feet behind me. I'm like, what are you doing? He's like, I don't need to go that fast. And I was like, oh, touche, because I'm used to trying to walk everywhere fast with a ruck on my back, so I get it. I should slow down. And you're like, well, you could be as fast as you want. I'm not going to. And I was like, okay, internal dialogue is different, right? Like in mine, it's like move with a sense of purpose, military. And honestly, I think that's a problem within the culture of the military too, is that we never experience the like, how do we slow down, right? Because it's always move with a sense of purpose. You know, guy says something and you hop to it or whatever else. But that dialogue needs to change and eventually get to that place where you can smell the flowers because you're saying to yourself, slow down, right?
Yeah.
Slow down, take it easy.
And I think it's interesting too, because as you tell the story about us being downtown, I think about that time when we're sitting and we're piled into this car. There are a lot of people, and really, it's like clown car-ish, right? Like there are far too many people in this car, and I'm in the middle. And you know what I'm going with this one.
Yeah. Want to put my toes in the grass.
I'm in the middle of all these people, and like Lloyd's going to do whatever random thing, and I'm like, all right, I got to get out. And the people in the car are like, what are you doing? I'm like, I'm gonna go sit in the grass. They're like, you're gonna go do what?
Yeah.
I'm gonna go sit in the grass. So I'm literally downtown Denver, sitting next.
Saw the smallest patch of grass in the corner.
It was like this little 10 by 10 little patch of grass next to the bus station or some random thing like that. And I'm sitting in the grass, I'm rubbing the grass with my hands, and I'm just chilling. And they're looking at me like, this dude is weird.
Yeah. And my friends are like, what's he doing? I was like, oh yeah, that's him. That's him for sure.
Yeah, it happens.
So are there, oh man. See that? No, they just took me back to preseason. The grass,
right?
Man. Yeah. Because when you want to talk, it's interesting. You talk about like the breathing for when you're at the firing range and you're getting that therapy there. For me, I would take, by the time I was, playing ball my senior year of high school, I had, sort of broken almost all my fingers at that point. It's somewhere along the way. So I had this soccer. Yeah, I was a goalkeeper. And so I had this ritual of taping my fingers up.
Yeah.
And I didn't like to be rushed. That was the first, I was finally starting my senior year to say, you don't have to be rushed all the time. You can take this time for you. Look at me come around. I'm freaking myself out. So yeah, but yeah, I would take that time and put on my tape. And I'm now just remembering, I would sit there in the grass because I'd be barefoot, and I would get, because I had to make sure that my tape was loose enough that I could still tie my shoes.
Yeah.
So I would do my hands first with my feet bare in the grass. I'm tripping out. All right, enough about my triggers. You guys, all right? Again, we are 8 episodes in, and we've got a great guest coming through, and not every episode can be 2 hours. Shout out Malibu Keith editing this.
Right.
Can you guys each just share maybe one thing, whether it was, when Greg was in here, or when we had Steve sitting in the chair, or maybe Angela talking about her journey around learning differences, Nippenberg, we had your kids in here, whether it was Megan talking about substance abuse stuff. Is there anything that you reflect on and say, like, yeah, that I felt that one?
It was the kids for me, for sure. That was the big one for me. And it was in the work that I've done. I've been to a lot of school meetings, IEP meetings, 504 meetings, whatever meetings for students.
Yeah.
To help begin the process of accommodations, and watching my kiddos like struggle in that moment where I'm like, oh, that's what it's like to like need a second to process a piece of information. Or Malibu Keith, we were talking about this morning at breakfast, like having that experience, like did they do a good job? Like was it okay? Like did they do what they were supposed to do, kind of a thing? Like that for me was probably, out of all of the stuff that we did, the hardest one for me to hold.
What was it triggering? Like, what was it calling up for you?
And they're my kids. It's like my heart's walking around outside in the world, and like they're right over there. Like that
so
was it.
Every strong feeling.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Every single thing. I mean, and I think most parents can can get on board with that piece of like you, and I don't know where I heard it, but at some point the thing that stuck with me was like when you have a kid, it's like you take your heart and it's like walking around in the world, and it's intense. You know, even in this very protected, very safe environment, I still had that experience of like, I hope he's doing okay. Like I hope he's feeling okay with how he's doing.
And I won't pick that episode because I want to pick another one, not to steal your thunder. So, but the part of it that got me was waiting for them to respond.
Yeah.
And knowing that they need to process and knowing what that means, that everybody else in the room has to be patient.
Right.
And
you have to wait for it.
Yeah. It's almost like you want to be like, okay, I got you, dude. Just you sit there and think, and I will
Let dad put everyone else in headlocks.
Yeah, I'm gonna have them be silent for you. You just think, because I know whatever you come up with is going to be fantastic, and I know that they'll think that too. You guys just need to be patient. So you wait for him, right? And it's that like, don't you screw with him.
Right.
Let him think.
Lemire.
And it
This
was-
is not directed at Nathaniel. There's no way. Nathaniel is the chill. Nathaniel will just rub his feet in the grass and wait for a little dude to talk.
Well, for me, what was it's a piece of us when we were growing up, right? And knowing like
100%.
the workaround for us was finding a workaround because nobody had the patience,
Right.
to wait for us to think.
And that then is the trigger where it's not only your paternal feelings, but also your little Nathaniel, little Donald feelings.
100%,
Crazy.
Absolutely.
Experientially, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, and as of obviously grown, like I have, I call it filler. You know, so people will get nervous and they'll be like my filler is like I'll just ask you the same question that you just asked me, so I can think about what it is that you asked me, and then I'll more or less rephrase exactly what you said, and the whole time it's me figuring out how I want to answer your question.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
Yeah.
totally me putting together my own coping. Like that's my coping skill for that.
And Malloy, you said you had something different episode?
Well, it's interesting because I feel like it's kind of it's very similar to talking about the kiddos. When Greg was on, I couldn't help but feel, and I experienced this when we do our trauma presentations. When we do the trauma challenge, we're in a room with people that are building rapport with each other. They're learning the design of talking about their trauma, and then they start telling their story. And at the trauma presentation and having Greg in here, I mean, I couldn't help but like almost be, I don't know what the word is. Like I'm like scared for him because I know this is emotional. I know it's taxing. I know it's heavy. And so while he's in there telling his story, I'm thinking like, this is going to help so many people. I really hope everybody gets this message. All these things are beautiful for him to go through and everybody else to hear. And that's also very taxing, right? And then I find myself like wanting to protect, right? Wanting to throw the cape on and be like, how do I need help, right? And I know he's in a really good place, right? I know he's in such a good place that it's not going to tear him down to a point where it's going to cause problems. But at the same extent, just kind of like the boys, it's like, I want to protect him, you know?
It's interesting too, because as you talk about that, one of the things that was hard about that episode for me was everybody else in here, outside of you. Like everybody else was just floored, and justifiably so. I mean,
Sure.
it's a huge story,
Yeah.
and it's very heartfelt and very genuine. And that was an experience that I had around like, oh wow,
Everybody else is
flipping out,
Yeah. Like
this
everybody else is, this is heavy for everybody.
right?
Right.
And we talked about it later, but I was like, well done, man. Like,
Yeah.
good show. Like
Yeah.
good on you. Like I mean, I was like happy and proud of him.
Yeah.
Watching him tell the story, and then like I would catch glimpses of everybody else in the room, and Malibu Keith is laughing because he knows it's true. Everybody else in the room was just floored,
Yeah.
and it was seeing that emotional experience for other folks and reconciling all of that.
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
was
Which
crazy.
is the superhero syndrome, right? Because we can be happy and glad and everything, and then all of a sudden we like sense that peace and we want to fly in and help. Right.
Yeah.
We want to jump in and help out where we can.
Yeah. So I think part of making that distinction between being triggered and nervous.
Oh, and we should say, so Malibu Keith brought up a great point.
Yes.
I don't know, Nathaniel, can you sort of like sum up what he was saying?
So part of what he was saying is that like let's make the distinction between being nervous and being triggered, which is super useful. And for me, when you asked the question of what is it that was triggering for you during the course of this, like that was my piece, was like my kids. And I think there definitely is a distinction to be made between being nervous about them doing well and, you know, them being successful and, you know, being, my heart is walking around out there, like makes me nervous. Versus if, you know, somebody comes and I'm sitting down at a meeting with them and they're like, well, your kid's not going to be able to go to college because he can't read, then I'm going to lose them. Like,
because that is a lightning bolt.
yeah, that's a whole,
And you're not necessarily.
Yeah.
So the piece of this, I think, so for me, like, and this goes back to us trying to protect the kids that we were. So that's the triggering part, right?
Right. I think when it connects back to your own sense memory of being them.
Yes.
Right.
So remember that the triggering part is the brain crisis, remembers the moment, the five senses. And for me as a kid thinking like nobody's going to listen, or I'm sorry, nobody's going to wait to hear the answer that I have. How do I get around that so that I can come up with the answer? And the triggering part is my son is taking the time to answer. It's triggering in that I want for people to, you know, to leave them alone for a second. And I feel that triggered piece while I'm hoping that they have patience. The nervous piece would then be that I just hope he succeeds. And I'm sitting here kind of like, you got this, buddy. You got this.
Right.
Not the little kid in me is freaking out because nobody gave me that opportunity.
Right. The triggering part for me is like all of a sudden I'm back in my first grade classroom looking for a pencil.
100%.
Yep.
Yeah. That's it.
That's the full circle. Thank you, Keith. That was necessary.
That definitely is necessary.
Yeah.
For sure.
Tiff, what about you?
It was definitely Greg's interview. And to speak to that, because I remember when the episode ended, one of you said, "Oh my gosh, Tiffany, you're like crawling out of your skin over there." And I said, because it touched a piece of my story. So growing up in a abusive home, having multiple instances of sexual abuse, sexual assault, going into the military, experiencing military sexual trauma, hearing him tell, even though it was a completely different story, different time frame, different people, it touched that part of my story. And that's what triggered me from his story. I mean, sure, listening to his story from beginning to end, there's lots of parts there that are uncomfortable and hard to hear and way heavy on your heart. But that part is the part that triggered me.
And the trigger being something that you're not consciously able to regulate because it's like, here we go, it's happening. Am I sort of understanding the...
So I think the trigger goes to the emotion, right?
Okay.
So when the trigger is like the memory to the emotion, that's the part that that's why you're triggered, is it's the emotion.
Okay.
So as soon as so if you're interacting in a space and that thing, that whatever sight, sound, smell, whatever, blah, blah, presents itself, you can be triggered by that. But internally, you know, it's going to go through that emotional channel, right? If it doesn't go through,
right? Is it like then?
It doesn't get to the thinking part of your brain.
Okay. Boom. I guess that's maybe what I'm trying to drill down on, and I'm wading into waters that I don't I'm the playwright. Let's remember that. Okay. I don't know what the fuck I'm doing. So let's just clarify
you're doing
that.
A great job.
I'm trying, Tiffany. It's very nice of you to say.
Well, the beauty of this is because should you not know, if you were the clinician, you wouldn't be asking those things. If Malibu Keith,
Cleeth is his rap battle name.
If Keith was not, if he were a clinician, he would not have brought up the idea of being nervous versus being triggered.
Right.
Right. Because they're very different things. So as the playwright, it's necessary for you to say these things that you sometimes are going to feel uncomfortable saying, but it's because you feel like you might be stepping on our toes or
and I also don't want to wade into I think one of the things that has been such a blessing for me as someone who looks to use storytelling as a vehicle for healing, right? That's ultimately my goal, is to make sure that particularly young people are feeling seen, heard, and inspired by the content they're either engaging with through a script, the work they're doing in a workshop, or ultimately through the stuff they're doing themselves. But and I've been lucky enough to have lots of people voluntarily share their stories with me over the years. That's been sort of my MO. One thing that I never quite know is how it's going to land if I ask a question about somebody's trauma or somebody's trigger, because it feels like I'm, as opposed to receiving, it feels like I'm going up to the water balloon.
That you're being intrusive.
I'm going up to the water balloon and being like, what's in your water balloon? And that does not feel nice or respectful.
Which is beautiful, though, because I recognize that is a very good boundary to have.
Right.
And then I'll say that we'll give you permission.
Okay.
And the reason why we give you permission is simply because if you do take her close enough to trauma, or Greg close enough to trauma, or anybody, we can pull them back.
Okay.
And so you're the guy who's doing exactly the right thing.
All right.
By being uncomfortable by doing it, because that's the right thing as well, and then still going ahead and doing it. Right. Because you're going to have those questions that we don't have.
Right. So, like, I guess, Tiffany, one thing that I wonder about for our listeners who similarly have gone through the sexual trauma that you've gone through and the sexual trauma that Greg has gone through, and obviously that so many people, both listening to this and in our culture community around the world, have experienced. What I'm wondering is, how helpful is it to take steps to protect yourself from those triggers, versus how helpful is it to examine them and delve into them in an act of I don't know what the healing process is like for that, or the just living process is like for that, and is it different for everybody?
I would say it's probably different for everybody. So I can only speak for myself, but I think it's important to factor in lessons learned, factor in who's in the room, what is the purpose or the intent of the conversation. And so, like I've mentioned, I'm an open book. I want to tell my story because I know there's other people out there with a similar or worse story that can feel this, can be validated in their own experience, but also know that there's light at the end of the tunnel if you do the work, but paying attention to those things. So, for example, again, when I was kind of new in the veteran community and working for a larger organization, one of the executives said, well, we want you to tell your story because we want to make people cry because that brings in money.
Oh,
That's not where I want to tell my fucking story. This is where this or the trauma challenge. Like when Greg I also told my story at the trauma challenge. That's an appropriate place to tell it. And it's not even that everyone in that room was the appropriate audience, but the setting was appropriate. The environment was appropriate. I felt supported by not just Donald, but the other people in the room that were there that I knew that loved me and care about me. So thinking about those things, like there are good places to open up that box, and there's other places where maybe this isn't the place. Or also finding different ways to tell the story. Like in some settings, I might go into more detail, and other settings I might brush the surface, like just saying, I have a long history of childhood and adult sexual trauma. I don't have to go into a lot of detail. Right. Maybe in a different setting, it would make more sense. If we had a episode that was specifically about military sexual trauma, I might go into more detail.
Right.
But again, I'm with a group of people that I trust, that I know that when it's over, I'm going to be in an environment where I can take care of myself. Other people are feeling that, protective. Not that I need that, but it's a good feeling to have, certainly. But knowing your environment and knowing your audience and the intent behind it.
Mm-hmm. And I think another thing that's really important is that you don't want to be ever in a position where you're traumatized, like you're reopening a wound that's not ready to be opened again. Yeah. And like you in that situation where like tell your story because it's going to make people cry, like that's awful.
Yeah.
And
well, they were awful people. So
well, that those two things go hand in hand. But it's making sure that you're in a position where you're not re-traumatizing someone. Like you can't
Yes.
just go to someone and poke the balloon. I mean, and if you do, you need to work on your interpersonal skills.
Right.
Right.
I think that it's interesting because while I think about it, when I first approached a couple other clinicians about doing the trauma challenge, and I'll say more the presentation. The trauma challenge is pretty clinical and straightforward. The presentation becomes a little bit different. And I approached a couple clinicians, and they were like, "Well, yeah, so long as these people are supported, so long as there's resources in the room." And I was like, "Yep, we'll do all of that." But it still felt, it still felt taxing, right?
Oh,
and
for
it
sure.
is.
Yeah, 100%.
But I think the piece of it too that most people recognize whenever you're talking about your trauma, like including me and some of the things that I've been through, I don't normally come out and tell my trauma story, right? I've dealt with mine. But when I do, it's still taxing, right? And there's still, I would say for anybody who's had trauma that might think about like, well, how do I get past this? I would say it's a little bit different than getting past it as much as developing the lifestyle to live with it. Because, as we've talked about the trauma being put in the box and put on the shelf, that's a piece of you that's on the shelf. And until you pull it down and accept it, right? Recognize it for a piece of you, then you're never really giving your whole self. And so it goes back to that idea of like, you can trigger me and that's still mine to hold, right? It's not anybody else's. I will manage my stuff because you shouldn't have to manage my stuff. And at the same extent, I want to be able to tell my story with the people that I know will meet my story with empathy and understanding.
And I think while I do understand the idea of this isn't your stuff, this is my stuff, I also think the example you gave of the person who was like, let's get people to cry because we're going to bring in dollars. To me, the reason why that's such a problematic statement is that is somebody who is callous enough to not accept the responsibility they have as a human being talking to another human being. Like, and we can, and I think this maybe comes back to this original trigger thing that I talk about. While I do understand the impulse, and I think it's part of people's healing to say, no, I'm in control of this shit, right? I get that, and I get the ownership side, but I also don't feel comfortable letting everybody else off the hook. I think that we all have this, and this is just me, you guys don't have to agree with this. I think we all have a collective responsibility to be sensitive to the fact that everybody's gone through stuff and to go through life with a measure of respect for other people's fragility, such that we can then get the best out of our partnerships, right? Like
That's called being trauma informed. You understand that people have experienced things that could potentially cause triggers, which will bring up emotions, and you're aware of that and you're conscientious of it.
Right. And it doesn't mean being perfect, but ultimately it was that person's loss and that organization's loss that they didn't have that skill set. And it strikes me as this, while it's also a skill set to learn how to manage your own stuff, I think having a nominal level of being able to be respectful of other people's stuff just will let you get more good things done. I'm not even putting a moral spin on it.
Well, there's a level of humanity to it for sure. I think the irony of it is that some people don't have that. I mean, not put too fine a point on it, but some people just don't have a baseline of being able to appreciate how their words or actions or interactions with other people or what they say or how close they get to other people are going to affect other folks. And it's not because they're bad humans. It's because they just don't have that frame of reference. And I think as much as I would love to be in that space with folks, there also is the reality that sometimes you meet people and you're just like, ooh,
Well,
you don't got it.
And well, in that piece too, usually if I see that, it reminds me of where that person is,
Right.
in terms of their own trauma, their own ability to treat other people well, their own ability to treat themselves well, right? So it goes back to this, like, it's a spectrum and we're all on it. Are we healthy or are you not? So a lot of times, so when you're saying this trauma-informed piece,
Tiffany, yeah, that was a very good word.
well, yeah, and it's a catchphrase in the clinical
Yeah,
space,
it's
right? If you're
important.
not
That's
trauma-informed, then you're not doing the right work. So
Right.
there's this piece of, so at this clinic that we have, we educate our community on what we would consider really kind of trauma-informed anything, from trauma-informed yoga to trauma-informed bowling, from trauma-informed golf.
Well, something as simple as you changing the name of that yoga pose.
Sure, absolutely.
Can you explain that real quick?
Yeah, so when we were doing yoga, there was a yoga teacher who came in, and for my veterans, said, we're going to go ahead and now move into Shavasana, but she called it the corpse pose because it is also called the corpse pose. And for my veterans, the corpse pose is just not going to settle well with them, right? So I said, so can we in the future go with just resting pose? Because for me, it's going to be a lot healthier.
It's a lot more rustful sounding.
Yeah, than corpse pose, right?
Death.
But so that goes back to the idea of, like, this is a culturally competent field, right? Anybody that's dealing with mental health in general, and also includes substance use in there, is going to know that people have trauma. People have trauma, and because of it, you should know that when people are, let's just say, not acting appropriate, it might not be because they're jerks. It might because they're jerks because they have trauma, and they might not have the wherewithal to know what and why and how they're doing whatever. And we can just see those people potentially as, like, okay, so you're not ready yet. You know, and I'm not going to have that conversation with them, but if I did, it would be like, you're not ready yet because your trauma put you in a place where you need a little bit more healing before we are actually people that you want to connect with in this room.
Right, where you're treating emotional experiences transactional.
Right.
Right.
Something has happened.
And to go back to that piece that you were just talking about with the yoga pose, right? Like that person, that instructor is not doing it out of malice.
Right.
They're just uninformed.
Right.
And as soon as you say, hey, by the way, we might want to switch that language up a little bit. It makes sense. They can own that, and then we can move forward.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean they're a bad human as much as they just didn't know.
Right. Yep.
So, as per usual, we had the best intentions of having this be like a 25-minute conversation. Instead, it's its own episode, which means that when we sit down and talk shop with Kyle, we knew that conversation was just going to be like a bird that we let loose in a field. So we can let that be episode 8B or 8 part 2. So I feel inclined to grab final thoughts from you guys, and then final thoughts from one MC on the God mic, Tiffany Morgan, and we'll close out Harder Than Healing episode 8 and then see what kind of shenanigans we get into on the flip side.
I think it's a terrible idea.
When do we start?
When do we start?
Like your shirt.
Exactly. It's a terrible idea. What time? Let's go do some therapy. That's a horrible idea. When's my appointment?
Yeah.
I think this has been a really wonderful journey thus far with you guys. I mean, it's been really, really fun. I mean, obviously, I spend a ton of time with Malloy, so we kind of, I don't know, share the same brain at this point, but like we have had a lot of conversation, and it's been amazing to interact now. But Keith has been wonderful on the 1MC, and then Jason, your guidance around like helping us get to some of the subject matter that we've gotten to. It's just been really fun. And if people have watched the podcast at this point, you could be thinking to yourself like, that was fun.
You make trauma fun.
You are
Put that on a shirt.
something's wrong
I
with you,
make trauma fun.
right? But I think it's been a really wonderful experience. So as we kind of wrap up the first season of things, I've really enjoyed hanging out with you guys. It's been cool. So thank you.
And if I had to wrap this up, I'd say like we're just getting started.
That's not a wrap up. That's an opener.
I know. And I mean, I hate to say it, if you know anything about me, like I'm a very forward thinker, so I can't help but recognize that this is like a platform for a lot of the stuff, you know, to come. And I think it's kind of cool because as we just had this conversation about, you know, potentially feeling uncomfortable about where the line in the sand is when it comes to talking to people about trauma. And I just think about what message can that send to our audience, and saying, you're right, like we all need to think about what appropriate feedback is, but we still need to get the feedback. We still need to work on the feedback. I think there's a nonprofit out there, and Tiffany, help me if I forget this or if I fuck it up, but just ask the fucking question, right? And that's supposed to be for suicide prevention. So we might all be scared of trauma in some way, shape, or form. I think it's just absolutely 100% critical for us to be responsible for our own stories and to search for that feedback. And the more appropriate we can do, the more appropriate setting we can do that in, the better, right? And as we wrap this up, I just keep on thinking about, like, for you guys, I mean, you guys have already just become family for me, so this is fantastic. But what it really means to me is that this is a safe place for us to continue to explore, all these things that I know all our listeners and veterans are probably going to really, really benefit from. As much as I didn't know if that was going to be the case, sitting in here for however many hours we've done this for now, I really think we've talked about some incredibly heavy stuff that everybody needs to hear, and will probably support, probably support a boatload of people. I'm really proud of it. And yeah, thanks for being on the journey with me. It's been fantastic.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm going to talk about coping skills still.
I love it.
So I'm saying that to say that we all experience triggers. Some of us, it might happen more frequently because there's more work that needs to be done. But through just remembering that throughout that process, it can be a bit of a roller coaster. You might feel like you're doing really well for a while, and then all of a sudden Greg comes in and tells a story, and then you've crashed and burned, and you're like, how do I pick myself up
that
from
sound
this?
wave, right? That sound wave.
Yeah. And so even just little things, like for me personally, having patience and grace with myself, growing up in a very black and white, rigid environment. So I have a Post-it note on my fridge it's probably been there for 3 or 4 years that says, you don't have to be perfect. I have another one in one of my kitchen cabinets that says, trust yourself and trust God. Or knowing that when I go into something that is going to be triggering, that I have to do, I got to go do it, got to go do this thing, that when I come back home, that I intentionally set space and time, and don't just be like, oh, I'll be fine, and just jump right back into everything. Like, there's times where I might need a day or two to like drool on the couch. And that while I'm drooling on the couch, I don't need to feel anxious about why I'm drooling on the couch. I can just drool on the couch and know that tomorrow's a new day, and I don't have to do it the next day. But I just got to get it out of my system.
Yeah.
So making sure you find what works for you, whether it's the quick in the moment stuff, the breathing, the tactile stuff, or coloring or hiking or exercising or whatever, that you find that group of coping skills that works for you for different situations. And just remembering to keep grace for yourself, especially.
Man, that's so important. I needed to hear that. Well, I'll tell you what, episode 8, FUBAR, and yet also a bit of a snafu.
Sure. I
Yeah.
like it.
It's been episode 8. It's been such a pleasure. With gratitude for these 3 folks next to me, for Malibu Keith on the ones and twos. We're going to leave you how we always leave you, and that's with a reminder. Absolutely, 100%. If you need to hear this right now, then hear it. You're worth the healing.
Hi, my name is Watika Ling, and I am the CEO of Warrior Now. And I want to thank you for listening to Harder Than Healing, produced in partnership with All Points North and Warrior Now. This podcast is recorded on the APN campus in Edwards, Colorado. Warrior Now is a nonprofit organization that provides veterans a whole health approach through peer-to-peer services. For more information, you can contact us at info@warriornow.org or pod@heartedandhealing.com. You can also find us on all social media platforms at Warrior Now. Like, share, or subscribe for new episodes. Thank you.